The midwife held her breath as she wrapped the first child in swaddling cloth. His tiny body was cold, lifeless. No breath had passed through his lips, but then he cried. It wasn't a normal cry, not the wail of a newborn entering the world. It was sharp, piercing, like something ancient clawing its way out of darkness. Room fell silent, except for the sound of that unnatural scream. Elizabeth Hargrove lay weak on the bed, sweat clinging to her pale face. Her husband Thomas stood frozen by the door, clutching the frame so hard his knuckles turned white. Their second child came moments later, alive and healthy, yet eerily quiet. Midwife didn't speak. She simply handed Elizabeth the living twin and avoided looking at the other. Something about him felt wrong. Days passed, and the household grew uneasy. Dead twin had been buried in the family plot behind the house, but his cries lingered in their minds. Thomas refused to speak of it, dismissing it as grief playing tricks on them. But Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a mistake. One night, as she nursed the living twin, she heard it again, a faint cry drifting through the walls of the cabinet. Sounded distant, yet close enough to make her blood run cold. Thomas, she whispered, shaking her husband awake. Do you hear that? Thomas groaned and rolled over, pulling the blanket over his head. It's just the wind. Go back to sleep. But Elizabeth knew better than to believe him. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the baby, and followed the sound. It led her outside to the edge of the woods, where the moonlight filtered weakly through the trees. There, beneath the soil where they had buried the stillborn, she saw movement. Ground shifted slightly, as though something beneath it were trying to break free. Elizabeth stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a tree root. Her heart pounded as memories flooded her mind. 10 years earlier, before she married Thomas, she had heard whispers among the women of Kentucky tales of children born under cursed stars who brought ruin to their families. They said such children were marked by death themselves, neither fully alive nor truly gone. At the time, she had dismissed them as superstition, old wives' tales meant to scare young mothers. But now, standing there, staring at the shifting earth, she wondered if there was truth to those stories. When she returned to the house, Thomas was waiting for her, his face grim. You shouldn't have gone out there, he said sharply. What did you see? Elizabeth hesitated, then shook her head. Nothing, she lied, but deep down she knew she couldn't keep this secret forever. That night, Elizabeth dreamed of the twins. They stood side by side, holding hands, though one was translucent and glowing. Faint, live, living twin reached out to her, smiling softly, but the other tilted his head and spoke in a voice far too old for a child. Mother, why did you bury me? Elizabeth woke with a start, her chest heaving as tears streamed down her face. Next to her, the living twin stirred in his cradle, cooing softly, but when she leaned over to check on him, she froze. Air reflected in the window beside the crib were two figures, not one. Elizabeth spun around, scanning the room, but found nothing unusual. The living twin slept peacefully, unaware of the terror gripping her heart. Yet, in the reflection, the second figure remained standing beside the crib, its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and then it smiled. Elizabeth couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, the dead twin, smiling. That unnatural smile. His voice echoed in her mind, repeating the same question over and over. Why did you bury me? By morning, she was exhausted, her hands trembling as she prepared breakfast for Tom. Ash noticed her pale face, but said nothing, assuming it was just the stress of childbirth. But Elizabeth knew better. She had seen something in the reflection last night, something that defied explanation, and now every shadow in the house seemed heavier, darker, as though they were watching her. Living twin began to act strangely too, cried incessantly no matter how much Elizabeth tried to soothe him. His tiny fists clenched tightly as if fighting against him. Invisible fortune. Evening, while feeding him, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. When she turned her head, there was nothing there, but when she looked back at the baby, his expression had changed. His lips curled into a faint smile, eerily similar to the one she'd seen in her dream. No, Elizabeth, pulling away from him. This isn't real. Yet deep down she knew it. Waste presence in the house grew stronger with each passing day. Doors creaked open on Pond 1. Their own footsteps echoed through empty hallways. Thomas began to feel it, though he refused to admit it. It's just the wind, he muttered whenever Elizabeth mentioned it. Old houses make noises, but Elizabeth wasn't convinced at desperate. For answers, Elizabeth visited the local midwife who had delivered the twins. The woman listened quietly, her weathered face growing paler with each word. Finally, she sighed and leaned forward, lowering her voice. There are stories, she began hesitantly, about children born under certain conditions, children who aren't meant to stay buried. Elizabeth's breath hitched. What do you mean? The midwife avoided meeting her gaze. Some say they're tied to this world by unfinished business. Others claim their vessels for something older, something darker. She paused, then added softly, whatever they are, they don't rest easily. Elizabeth left the midwife's cabin feeling more uneasy than before. As she walked home, the woods seemed alive with whispers calling her name, Elizabeth. She quickened her pace, clutching the basket of herbs tightly, but the whispers followed her all the way to the edge of the property. That night, Elizabeth dreamed again. This time, she found herself standing in the middle of the family burial plot. Moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the grave sand. There beneath the soil where the stillborn twin lay buried, the ground began to shift. A small hand broke through the dirt, followed by another. Then slowly the rest of him emerged, covered in earth, his wide eyes glowing. Faintly, mother, he said, his voice calm yet chilling. You shouldn't have left me. Before Elizabeth could react, the scene shifted. She was back in her bedroom, staring at the cradle where the living twin slept, but instead of one baby, there were 12 second figures sat upright in the crib, its hollow eyes fixed on her. We belong together, it whispered. Elizabeth screamed, waking herself up. Her heart raced as she scrambled to check on the baby. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Living twin lay peacefully asleep in his cradle, but then she noticed something odd. The blanket covering him was torn as though clawed from beneath him. Beside him on the pillow was a single lock of hair. Elizabeth stared at the lock of hair on the pillow, her hands trembling. As she picked it up, it wasn't from the living twin. It was too dark, too coarse, and then she noticed something else. The blanket wasn't just torn, it was shredded, as though something sharp had clawed its way out. Her breath hitched as she turned to look at the baby. Slept peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily. But when she leaned closer, she saw faint scratches on his arms. What is happening to you? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. Thomas entered the room moments later, his face pale. What's wrong? He asked, his voice tight with uneasy. Elizabeth held up the lock of hair, unable to speak. Thomas took one look at it and turned away, muttering under his breath, this isn't natural. Over the next few days, the house grew colder, darker. Even the fire in the hearth seemed reluctant to burn. Elizabeth spent most of her time watching the baby, afraid to leave him alone even for a moment. But no matter how closely she watched, strange things kept happening. Toys moved on their own, shadows flickered across the walls, and sometimes when she looked at the baby, she swore she saw two figures instead of anyone. Night, as she rocked the cradle, she heard a soft whisper, let me hold him. Elizabeth froze, her grip tightening on the rocking chair. The voice wasn't coming from the room. It was inside her head. Please, mother, the voice continued, softer. This time, he misses me. She glanced at the baby, who stared back at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Who are you talking about? She demanded, her voice shaking. Baby didn't answer, but his lips curled into a faint smile, desperate for answers. Elizabeth returned to the midwife. This time, she brought the lock of hair, hoping it would help. Midwife examined it carefully, her hands trembling faintly. She sighed and placed it on the table. This isn't from a living person, she said softly. It's from someone or something that shouldn't be here. Elizabeth's heart raced. What do you mean? The midwife hesitated, then reached for an old book bound in cracked leather. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. There's a legend, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, about twins born under a cursed star, one living, one dead, reconnected by a bond that can't be broken. If the dead twin is separated from the living, they will stop at nothing to reunite. Elizabeth felt her stomach churn. What happens if they do? The midwife closed the book and met her gaze. Both worlds suffer. That night, Elizabeth dreamed again. She stood in a field of wildflowers, bathed in golden sunlight. Living twin sat in the grass, laughing as the wind ruffled his hair, but behind him stood the dead twin, his glowing eyes fixed on her. "You've kept us apart long enough," he said, his voice calm, yet chilling. "It's time to make things right." Before Elizabeth could respond, the scene shifted. She was back in the house, staring at the cradle, but this time the living twin wasn't Alaneth. Dead twin sat beside him, holding his hand there, fingers intertwined as though bound by invisible threads. "We belong together," they whispered in unison, and then the living twin's body went limp. Elizabeth woke with a start, her heart pounding. She rushed to the cradle and found the baby cold and lifeless. His tiny chest didn't rise or fall. "No," she screamed, clutching into her chest. "Please don't leave me." But as she held him, she felt something shift in her arms. When she looked down, she saw not one child, but 12. Dead twin lay beside the living, his glowing eyes locked onto hers. "Thank you, mother," he whispered, and then the room fell silent. Room was silent, except for Elizabeth's ragged breathing. She clutched both children to her chest, but they felt wrong. The living twin was cold, lifeless, while the dead twin radiated a faint, unnatural warmth. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Dead twin tilted his head and smiled softly. "We're together now, mother," he said, his voice calm, yet hollow. "Isn't this what you wanted?" Elizabeth shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I wanted you alive, both of you." The dead twin's smile faded, replaced by an expression of confusion. "Alive," he repeated, as though tasting the word for the first time. "I am alive, mother, just not in the way you understand." Before she could respond, the house groaned around. Hearth walls seemed to shift, the air growing heavier. Colder Thomas burst into the room, his face pale with terror. "What's happening?" he demanded, his eyes darting between Elizabeth and the twins. Elizabeth opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. Instead, she looked down at the twins, who were now holding hands tightly, their bond visible as faint glowing threads connecting their fingers. The days that followed were a blur of fear and exhaustion. House itself seemed alive, shifting and groaning, as though it were breathing. Doors slammed shut on their own, windows rattled even when there was no wind. Elizabeth tried to separate the twins, hoping to break whatever connection bound them, but every time she did, the living twin would cry inconsolably until the dead twin appeared beside him again. It was as though they couldn't or wouldn't be apart. Thomas grew increasingly distant, spending most of his time outside. He refused to speak about what was happening, claiming it was all in Elizabeth's mind, but deep down even he knew something was terribly wrong. Gone night. As Elizabeth sat by the fire, staring blankly into the flames, she heard a whisper, "You can't fight it." She turned sharply, expecting to see the dead twin, but the room was empty. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, softer this time. "You've already lost." Desperate for answers, Elizabeth returned to the midwife once more. At this time, she brought both twins, hoping the woman could help. The midwife took one look at them and stepped back, shaking her head. "You shouldn't have brought them here," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Why not?" Elizabeth asked, clutching the children tighter. The midwife hesitated, then sighed deeply. "The bond between them isn't just supernatural. It's ancient. When twins like these are born, they carry a piece of something older, darker, something that doesn't belong in this world." Elizabeth felt her stomach churn. "What happens if we don't stop it?" The midwife met her gaze, her eyes filled with sorrow. "The house will collapse under the weight of their presence, and everyone inside will be consumed." That night, Elizabeth dreamed of the twins again. They stood side by side, holding hands as always, but this time they weren't alone. Behind them loomed a massive, shadowy figure, its form constantly shifting, its glowing eyes locked onto her. "You cannot undo what has been done," it said, its voice reverberating through her mind. "They are mine now." Elizabeth woke, screaming to find the house shaking. Violet-lithe walls cracked and splintered, as though being torn apart from within. Thomas rushed into the room, his face pale with terror. "We need to leave now," he shouted, grabbing her arm, but Elizabeth shook her head. "We can't leave them behind." As she spoke, the twins appeared in the doorway, their glowing threads pulsing brighter than ever. "Mother," they said in unison, their voices eerily calm. "It's time." Before Elizabeth or Thomas could react, the floor beneath them gave way. They plummeted into darkness, landing hard on cold, damp earth. When Elizabeth opened her eyes, she found herself in a cavernous space. Walls glowed faintly, illuminating the twins standing before her, but something was different there. Forms were merging into a single entity, their glowing threads weaving together into a pulsating cocoon. What's happening? Elizabeth cried, scrambling backwards. Shadowy figure from her dream emerged from the darkness, its massive form towering over them. The cycle is complete, it rumbled, its voice shaking the very ground. And then the cocoon began to crack open. Cocoon cracked open with a deafening sound. A blinding light spilled out, illuminating the cavernous space. Elizabeth shielded her eyes, unable to look away. When the light faded, she saw the twins were gone, replaced by a single figure. It was neither child nor adult, but something in between. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, as though peering into her very soul. Mother, it said, its voice a blend of both twins, eerily calm yet impossibly ancient. You brought us here, now you must stay. Thomas grabbed Elizabeth's arm, pulling her backward. We need to leave now, he shouted, his voice trembling, but Elizabeth couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the ground, as though the earth itself held her in place. Shadowy figure loomed closer, its massive form casting an oppressive darkness over them. There is no escape, it rumbled, its voice shaking the cavern walls. They are mine now, as are you. Elizabeth's mind raced as memories flooded back. Unbidden, she remembered the midwife's warnings about the bond between the twin. Show they carried a piece of something older, darker, but she hadn't understood until now. The figure before her wasn't just a manifestation of the twins' bond, it was the source, the thing that had been watching, waiting all along. What do you want from us? Elizabeth demanded, her voice shaking. Figure tilted its head, studying her with unnatural stillness. To be whole again, it said simply. Before she could react, the ground beneath them began to tremble. Walls of the cavern crumbled, revealing countless glowing threads. They pulsed with energy, connecting everything in sight. Elizabeth realized the truth too late as the threads tightened around her. Elizabeth saw flashes of the past midwife's warnings, Thomas's denial, her own guilt and fear. She had tried to protect the living twin, but in doing so she had doomed them. Both threads weren't just binding the twins, they were binding her. Familiar, their emotions, their choices, their sins had woven this nightmare together. You cannot undo what has been done, the figure said, its voice echoing in her mind. But you can choose how it ends. Elizabeth turned to Thomas, who stood frozen, tears streaming down his face. We have to let go, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas shook his head violently. No, we can't lose them. But Elizabeth knew there was no other way. Summoning every ounce of courage, Elizabeth stepped forward. She reached out toward the figure, her hands trembling. Take me instead, she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. The figure paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. You would sacrifice yourself for them? Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes. For a moment nothing happened. Then the threads began to unravel, slowly at first, then faster. The figure let out a low growl, its form shifting and writhing in anger. So be it, it rumbled, and then it lunged forward, engulfing her in light. When the light faded, Thomas found himself standing alone in the ruins of their home. The twins were gone, the house was silent, but as he looked around, he noticed something strange. The air felt lighter, the shadows less oppressive. It was as though the weight that had crushed them for months had finally lifted. He'd collapsed to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. In the distance, he thought he heard laughter, faint and distant, but when he turned to look, there was no one there. That night, Thomas dreamed of Elizabeth. He stood in a field of wildflowers, bathed in golden sunlight. Beside her were the twins, holding her hands tightly. We're free now, she said softly, her voice filled with peace. Thomas woke with a start, tears streaming down his face. He knew deep down that she was gone, but so was the darkness. From that day forward, he never spoke of what happened, but sometimes late at night, when the wind blew just right, swore he could hear her voice whispering, we're together now, the end.